I'm watching Irish and Palestinian flags being burned in Northern Ireland. It's part of an annual pro-British celebration.
At a time when people all over the world are flying the Palestinian flag in solidarity, it's crazy to be here and see it burn.
This is one of the most tense times of the year in Northern Ireland, which remains under British rule, when the already entrenched divisions between those who identify as British and those who identify as Irish are magnified. Every year leading up to July 12th, people build hundreds of bonfires here to celebrate England's victories during the colonization of Ireland. At one bonfire, participants burned a replica of a boat packed with refugees. And at others, they burned effigies of the Irish rap group Kneecap, whose lyrics are notably anti-British establishment. But at this bonfire, I saw something else. There's Israeli flags encircling the bonfire area in addition to the British flag, and I even saw a flag of the Israeli military. British loyalists in Northern Ireland often ally themselves with Israel to position themselves against the Irish, who have always stood in solidarity with Palestinians. We're probably gonna get out of here soon. I'm too Palestinian to be here, that's how I'm feeling. Even though decades of violence have ended in Northern Ireland, the separation between those loyal to the British Crown and those still pushing for Irish reunification remains stark.
Division wasn't always like this. Many times throughout Irish history, you've seen Catholics and Protestants coming together.
So I want to understand the roots of this divide and how centuries of British colonialism here connect to struggles around the world. And this young Irish activist is going to help guide me through it.
Ireland was one of the first colonial conquests of England. This was an imperial model for what happened across the global south.
When you think of British colonialism, you might picture an empire that extends far from the UK to places like Palestine, India, Kenya, and South Africa. But England's first colony was actually its neighbor, Ireland. English colonizers first invaded Ireland more than 800 years ago, laying the foundation for centuries of conquest and control. And the brutal tactics that Britain would export around the world, like divide and rule, famine, land grabs, and cultural erasure, they tested it all here on the Irish first. And today, part of the island is still under British rule, Northern Ireland. The morning after the bonfire, I went to another pro-British celebration. It commemorates the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, when Protestant King William III defeated Catholic King James II.
12th of July, it's a good day. It's better than Christmas.
Best day of the year. This is our culture.
That's our culture, Protestant culture. Donald Trump's abroad.
When it comes to Northern Ireland, there's a few terms you should know to understand how people here identify. There's Unionists, who are mostly from a Protestant background and identify as British. They want Northern Ireland, the area Britain kept when it was forced to concede Irish independence to remain in the UK. And there's Nationalists, who are mostly Catholic. They identify as Irish and want to see Ireland reunited. Then there's Loyalists and Republicans, who form the more radical wings of Unionism and Nationalism. They're the terms armed groups aligned with each position used to describe themselves. Protestant parades like these have historically and purposefully marched through Irish Catholic neighborhoods. And that's been seen by many as direct provocation and has been likened to when Israeli settlers marched through Palestinian areas.
So even though this appears to be a festive scene, it's important to note that it's essentially a celebration of British colonial dominance.
That story begins in the 12th century, when England set its sights across the Irish Sea, seeking to extend its royal control over Ireland. The Irish fiercely resisted over hundreds of years, and by the 1500s, Protestant England realized it needed a loyal base in Ireland to maintain its grip. The English forced many native Irish people off their lands and planted Protestant settlers, both English and Scottish, in their place. And it was the beginning of a settler colonial system that Britain would later replicate in places like Kenya and South Africa. In Ireland, the English established laws which stripped the Irish of the right to vote, own land, speak their language, or practice their religion.
The British learned very well that once you remove the language, for example, the colonization is so much easier.
Britain later imposed these policies on the indigenous peoples in colonies like North America and Australia. The British also contributed to a devastating famine in Ireland. In 1845, as the Irish people starved amid a potato blight, Britain continued exporting Ireland's food supply for its own population. Over 1 million people died. And a century later in Bengal, Britain did it again, putting its wartime needs above the local population suffering from a famine. 3 million people died there, the same colonial playbook. Then in 1916, the Irish led a famous armed rebellion against British rule, known as the Easter Rising. The British military crushed it within days, killing civilians and executing the rebel leaders. Their brutality shifted public opinion in support of republicanism, the vision for a free, independent Irish state. And then came the creation of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, which fought Ireland's War of Independence starting in 1919. During the war, the British sent in a violent paramilitary force who the Irish called the Black and Tans. Britain later sent the Black and Tans to Palestine.
This same British force that was set up to come here as a bulwark against Irish Revolution carried out atrocities. They then went to Palestine and carried out the same things later on.
In Ireland, the war came to an end in 1921, but the Irish only secured partial independence because Britain partitioned the island the year before. The British created Northern Ireland, and these 6 counties with Protestant majorities chose to remain part of the UK.
When the British partitioned Ireland, they saw that as the end game. That's it. We've subverted revolution, we've subverted any resistance. But in reality, every decade since then, there's been trouble in the north.
That's because the British continued to systematically discriminate against Irish Catholics living there. They suppressed the Irish language, denied Catholics equal rights in voting, employment, and housing, and their police often cracked down and beat those who protested. Eventually, the long-standing oppression of Irish Catholics boiled into 3 decades of armed conflict, known as the Troubles. There were Irish Republican paramilitaries on one side and Loyalist paramilitaries and the British state on the other. Over 30 years, more than 3,500 people were killed. Half were civilians.
Whole districts of the city were ablaze.
At its start, British troops were sent into Northern Ireland, setting in motion the longest ever British Army operation in history. They enforced a military occupation in Irish nationalist neighborhoods, conducting house raids, enforcing curfews, and carrying out mass arrests. Meanwhile, the IRA split and created a new group under the name the Provisional IRA. They wanted to reunite Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland and end British rule.
We cannot match the firepower of the British Army, but we will use all our methods and all our means.
The conflict exploded as both British repression and Irish resistance grew. British forces arrested hundreds of Catholics without charge or trial. Then in 1972 came a turning point. As thousands of Catholics peacefully marched for civil rights, British forces opened fire and killed 14 people.
Almost before the ambulances had reached hospital, Catholics were calling it Bloody Sunday.
Something must be done to make the English people realize that we are not cattle to be slaughtered.
The Bloody Sunday killings led to a surge in support for the Provisional IRA, which intensified its attacks. They carried out a series of car bombings and shootings, including on mainland UK, aimed at bringing their struggle to the heart of the empire. Britain labeled the group a terrorist organization. But over the century, oppressed peoples around the world had been watching how the Irish fought back. Across the British Empire, from Jamaica to Palestine, anti-colonial leaders drew inspiration from Ireland's fight for freedom, seeing it as a mirror for their own struggles. Nelson Mandela saw the Irish fight as deeply connected to South Africa's struggle against apartheid. And Palestinian prisoners have long used hunger strikes to protest their unjust imprisonment. That's a tactic that echoes campaigns led by Irish Republicans like Bobby Sands. His death in prison in 1981 sparked international solidarity.
14 Irish prisoners have now died by fasting this century.
Remarkably, while on hunger strike, Bobby Sands, who was part of the Provisional IRA, was nominated by the movement to run for a seat in the British Parliament. He won, but never took his seat. That was part of a shifting Irish Republican strategy, rejecting British rule while running for elections. They did this to show the popularity of their cause, and at the time, support for the Sinn Féin Republican Party was surging.
We politically defend the right of the IRA to engage in armed resistance to British forces.
After 3 decades of fighting, the Troubles came to an end in 1998 as paramilitaries put down their arms.
An agreement that unites Loyalist and Republican, Unionist and Nationalist leaders.
It was called the Good Friday Agreement, and it established a power-sharing government between Nationalists and Unionists and affirmed Northern Ireland's place in the UK unless its people chose, at any point in the future, to vote otherwise. It also ensured there would be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But some physical barriers do remain. You know, I've reported from the separation wall in the occupied West Bank for years, but I don't think I was prepared for how I'd feel to see a wall here, also dividing people who live in such close proximity. These walls are a lasting remnant of the decades of violence and turmoil. There are around 34 kilometers of them, mostly in Belfast. Authorities here began building them during the Troubles to separate working-class Irish and British communities. The walls were meant to be a short-term measure, but for many nationalists, they quickly became symbols of segregation and control. Can you imagine these walls ever coming down?
I can imagine the division coming apart. We've seen it before in Irish history, many times with Catholic and Protestant workers coming together. There's so much more similarities between us. Both have landlords that are ruining housing conditions. We are also dealing with the same cost of living.
Yeah, you're saying it's a class thing more so than a religious
thing.
or nationalist.
Absolutely. We're falling under the same boot of a ruling class that's continuing to make more wealth, while the other end of the polar, both Catholic and Protestant, becoming more poor as the day goes by.
Northern Ireland is grappling with high levels of inequality, and people across both communities suffer from persistent poverty, earning the lowest wages in the UK.
It's damage that the British government has done here, and it'll take time to restore that class unity, for sure.
But while some nationalist and unionist communities are coming closer together since the Good Friday Agreement, a new target of violence has emerged: migrants and refugees. As the global far-right rises, Northern Ireland is once again seeing familiar sights: houses being burned, riots, and clashes. This time it's to drive out migrants who are being used as a convenient scapegoat for problems that long predate their arrival. But many say that the real roots of the unrest lie in deep societal inequalities, and they're redirecting attention to a system that has long profited from hatred and division.
We've seen what the British imperialist interference does to our people, to Catholics and Protestants. Continuing to sow division, we have no benefit from being under the foot of the British government. We need to be talking about a united Ireland for the working class. I think that's the most important thing that is in front of us.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for my upcoming videos. I'll be asking people if they want a united Ireland, and I'll talk to a former IRA volunteer who risked everything in pursuit of that goal and for the freedom of her people.